monitoring questions during the discussion and has saved time at the end to answer any of these questions. This session is worth 0.75 CM credits, and more information on how to log those credits is available in the handout section. We could not host this event without the support of our sponsors, who are listed in the agenda and speaker bios in that handout section. Please make sure to take a look. Thanks for your attention today, and I'm going to hand it over to Lester.
Thank you, Macy. I appreciate it. And good afternoon to all of you. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome my friend, Steve Bousquet. Steve is a journalist with vast experience and knowledge of Florida politics and policy. Currently the editorial page editor for the South Florida Sun Sentinel, where his column also appears frequently, and also in the Orlando Sentinel and widely distributed elsewhere. Steve was, prior to his current assignment, the Capitol Bureau Chief for the Tampa Bay Times, and worked before that covering state politics for the Miami Herald. As a sign of the depth of Steve's knowledge and experience, he also holds a master's degree in history from FSU. And the subject of his master's degree thesis was the famous 1970 Walk-in Lawton campaign, the come from behind total surprise campaign victory by Lawton Chiles, who was elected to the United States Senate that year. Steve, welcome. And we've got an election year coming up, 2022. Maybe not as exciting as a presidential year, but particularly by Florida standards, we've got a lot going on. What do you see out there?
Yes, well, thanks very much, Lester, for the introduction. Great to see all of you this afternoon. I eagerly await your questions on any and all topics. Yes, it's an election year like no other. I know that that's a common refrain or cliche, but here's what's really different about this one. As everyone knows, some to their great chagrin, we've never had a governor quite like Ron DeSantis. And if you read my editorial page at the Sun Sentinel, hopefully never again, for lots of reasons. But he is a one-off individual. He has a huge national following. He is not to be taken lightly as a potential presidential candidate in 2024, but first he has to get reelected as governor. Now, it looks at the moment like pretty smooth sailing. He's ahead in every poll, though, believe it or not overwhelmingly. I don't put a whole lot of stock in polls this far out. I don't think anybody's really paying attention. The political dynamics in this state can change on a dime. And I'll give you a couple of examples momentarily. But, you know, you look at the Democratic field, and I know from traveling around this state that rank and file Democrats are not enthusiastic at all about the choices they have. Now, you know, the Democratic antipathy toward DeSantis is astounding. There has never been a governor in my lifetime in this state who has been so polarizing. A lot of people really like DeSantis, love the guy, and a lot of people, I mean, not just don't like him, they detest him, and they're frightened by him, actually. He is a frightening political figure to a lot of people, and it has to do with this authoritarian streak that we've seen, which I could go into to some degree, but which all of you maybe are familiar with yourselves. Changes to the voting laws, the so-called Anti-Riot Act, issues dealing with what are perceived as a crackdown on free speech. It doesn't look very promising for the Democrats at the moment, but I said things can change on a dime, and I want to back that up with a couple of points that I think may have some validity, but I can't predict the future. But I do think And from what I've seen in the Capitol in the last few weeks during this legislative session, I do think that this 15-week ban on abortions is an issue that has the potential to seriously change the political dynamics in this state. I've been covering the Florida legislature for 30 years, and for most of those 30 years, I've watched arrogant politicians trample on the rights of everyday Floridians, and I'm talking about politicians in both parties. The current crowd doesn't give a damn what the public thinks about a lot of things, really. They are hell-bent on doing what they want to do and what they think is in the best interests of Floridians. There's probably no issue in our lifetime that separates us so fundamentally as abortion, and it's an issue that needs no introduction or explanation to most people. Keep in mind that the legislature is about to pass a 15-week abortion ban without any exceptions for rape or incest, which is why progressives and pro-choice groups are referring to this with a straight face as a rapist's Bill of Rights, where Florida is closely following the Mississippi statute in this regard. Now, the reason I think it has the potential to change the political dynamics is because of the tremendous level of energy and emotion that I see from people who do not think this bill is necessary or warranted, and they're coming forward. And something I saw this morning should concern every Floridian. People are driving through the middle of the night, 6 and 7 hours. They're driving from places like Port Charlotte to get to Tallahassee, driving through the night without sleep, and they are given 45 seconds to testify at a legislative committee meeting before their legislature, their elected leaders, public servants. I realize that there's always a thing about Lester Abinger has taught me a lot about this through the years. One of the most important things in the legislative session is the clock. We are that rare state that has a 60-day legislative session that has a beginning, middle, and an end. It ends. It's going to end this year on, I believe it's March 11th,
Right.
unless they go into overtime. And so that creates all sorts of political dynamics and challenges. But one of the things it creates, and I've written about this extensively, it creates this sense of rage in the populace that, you've got a constitutional right to seek a redress of grievances before your elected leaders. And public comment, public input is always marginalized, minimized, pushed to the back of the agenda. The chairman says, do you really have to testify? I mean, it's repetitive. And can't you just waive in opposition to the bill? They're discouraging the taxpayers of this state from stating their opinions. That's deplorable, inexcusable. It's already, as everyone knows, I've lived in the far southern reaches of Florida, and I've lived in the far northern reaches of Florida, and I know, like we all know, how difficult it is to get to Tallahassee from the rest of the state. It's almost impossible. You tell people that when you live in Tallahassee, you're much closer to the state capital. Problem is that it's Atlanta that you're close to, not. I mean, you're closer to Atlanta and Tallahassee than you are to Miami. Is my point.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Democrats are in a bad and a sad place, and they keep making self-inflicted mistakes to make things worse for themselves. But they announced this week that they're going to spend $2.5 million to try to register a lot of new voters, hundreds of thousands of new voters. I've heard this before. I'll believe it when I see it. Registering, even if they're wildly successful, that's only half the equation. You've got to get these new voters to vote. It's an article of faith in political science and in government in this country that the older you are and the more you have voted, the more likely you are to vote. And if you haven't voted and you're not used to voting, you're less likely to vote. So that's the challenge that the Democrats face, is not just registering all these new voters, but making sure they get to the polls in a midterm non-presidential election, when in this state, the turnout for a midterm election is generally
20%.
15 to 20 points lower than a presidential election.
Yeah.
So Lester, if you have questions coming in, I'll pause right now and we can start taking questions.
Well, let me pose a couple to you, and maybe as a follow-up on your comments about the state of the Democratic Party. Politico reported yesterday that, quote, there's an ongoing debate among national party officials, donors, and major outside groups over how much time and money to commit to Florida in the wake of crushing losses in recent years. Democrats face, quote, an uphill battle, bruising losses in the last 3 election cycles. Florida's status as the nation's largest swing state is in question.
Oh, well, Florida is not the nation's largest swing state anymore.
There we go.
And I don't think we are. They can get it back, but they've got to win. They've got to win an election. A good place to start, a plausible place to start, is for Val Demings to defeat Marco Rubio.
Right. For context, tell everybody what
sure.
What is at stake in that.
Well, you know, we're in a 50-50 United States Senate, and I think the national landscape favors the Republicans because there are more Democrats having to defend their seats in tough places, you know, where victory is not assured, Arizona being one, for example. And so Marco Rubio is running for a 3rd term, being challenged by Congresswoman Val Demings of Orlando, who is Black, a former police chief, a strong law enforcement background, not somebody, although they'll try to do it, not somebody you can pigeonhole and marginalize as a far left socialist Democrat. The Republicans are going to use that same playbook in this election because it worked for them very successfully in 2020. It worked most successfully in Dade County, which is the most important county to Marco Rubio's survival.
Right.
Rubio has to do well in Dade. And so about every 2 or 3 election cycles, we have one like this, where it's a non-presidential year and the governorship and the United States Senate are on the ballot at the same time.
Right.
Guess what? Guess what race gets all the attention? It's the governor's race. Many people who vote won't even know there's a U.S. Senate race. Yeah, they'll see the ads, but they don't sink in. So, but I think Demings is a strong candidate. She's from Orlando. Rubio's got lots of problems. Rubio voted against the infrastructure bill. Rubio has sort of pussyfooted around with Trump. Rubio has these stories about he's got a woefully bad attendance record at committee meetings on Capitol Hill. So there's a lot for Val Demings to work with.
Right.
But the central thing is for Democrats to get out the vote. And that's always a problem for Democrats in a midterm election.
Midterm election. Other midterm election issues, all of the state's congressional delegation will be up with one added seat in Central Florida. And again, lost in the noise, so to speak, are all of the cabinet members who are independently elected or up for re-election. Again, going back to your theme, which I agree with, about the state of the Democratic Party, it doesn't look like to me that they've identified any credible candidates for Agriculture Commissioner, Attorney General, or Chief Financial Officer.
No, they don't. We could be looking at, again, something that's close to unprecedented, which is incumbent cabinet members getting a free ride and not being challenged. I mean, it's almost March. Qualifying for these seats is in June. The primary election is in August, but the vote by mail ballots start going out a month earlier. So people are going to be voting in July, and it's almost March. It's later than you think. And I've talked about this issue with Manny Diaz, the chairman of the Democratic Party, and I gave him some unsolicited advice. I said, find a really strong candidate for Attorney General. If you cannot win back the governorship, the next best thing easily, and it's within striking distance, is to recruit and find a really strong candidate for Attorney General. I don't have someone in mind. I could suggest some people. It would be pure speculation. But the Attorney General's office has been grossly politicized, first by Pam Bondi and now by Ashley Moody. It is not performing in the interests of most Floridians. And it's a seat where the Democrats could begin to find a path back to relevance and to prominence by winning that seat, even if they lost everything else. If the Democrats lose everything else, and the Democrats, by the way, are likely to lose the Agriculture Commissioner's office, where Nikki Fried is the only statewide elected Democrat.
Well, you have the Senate president sitting there who is basically an announced candidate for that spot and was furiously raising money before the session began, as you and I call it, preemptive fundraising to scare off any challengers there.
Yeah, one of the reasons why Republicans do so well in cabinet races, because these are down ballot races that the public isn't paying close attention to, that are heavily driven by money. And to put it in historical context, of course, for decades, for generations, Democrats won those races. So it was only in the 1990s that Republicans began to find a way that they could start winning cabinet seats, and they got more and more successful at it. And now, that for a long time, they've been the dominant party on the cabinet. The cabinet is very important. Ron DeSantis has, again, marginalized the cabinet, sees the cabinet as some sort of a vague threat, I guess, doesn't want to give Nikki Fried a forum to criticize him. So we've gotten to a point where there hasn't been a cabinet meeting in about 6 months in the state,
And they used to be every 2 weeks, period.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so the Democrats don't have candidates for the cabinet seats. But if they recruited Mother Teresa tomorrow to run for Attorney General, it would still be an uphill climb, like for the reasons I mentioned, which is these are money-driven races, and the party that's dominant politically in the state is going to have most of the money. It's always been that way.
Follow the money, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Give us your take for, you talked about the governor and his reelection campaign, and we have 3 Democratic candidates. Tell us about each one of those and what they might see as their path to victory against DeSantis.
Okay, yeah. Well, 3 very interesting, very different people. Charlie Crist, congressman from St. Pete, former governor as a Republican, switched parties. This is an astounding statistic, I think. This is his 6th statewide campaign. No one else can approach him in name recognition. Now, it's not all positive name ID because he's changed parties, and he has dealt with this reputation throughout his career as being sort of a political weather vane who sort of wants to say what people want to hear. There is so much toxic anger and hatred and tension in the political bloodstream in the whole country that Crist, one thing that has not changed about Crist is that he is a decent, positive, civil person who doesn't like, though he's engaged in his share of it through the years, you have to do it to survive, but he does not like engaging in nasty, negative politics with people. And so I think at the moment, it looks to me like he's the most likely person to win the nomination because he's a familiar, people vote for a familiar name and a familiar face. They don't even realize it many times, but people are comfortable with a name they know. So that's the story on Crist. Nikki Fried, the Agriculture Commissioner, is running, and Nikki so far and she's got a strong following, but she is, and she's the only Democrat who currently holds elected statewide office. You talk about a close race. I mean, she won by something like 10,000 votes over Matt Caldwell, a House member from Fort Myers area. But she won, and she has been a consistent and strong voice against DeSantis on everything since the day DeSantis raised his right hand. I think the wild card in the governor's race on the Democratic side is Annette Tadeo. Annette Tadeo is a Democratic state senator from Miami. She is a Colombian American. She was Charlie Crist's running mate when Charlie Crist ran for governor against Rick Scott in 2014, a race that people forget, but a race that Charlie Crist darn near won.
Right.
At the very end, Rick Scott wrote a $12 million check to himself and had some very effective, hard-hitting negative ads portraying Crist as a flip-flopper. Even though you can vote a month before the election, it is still a truism, I think, that a lot of voters tune into these races very late. Oh yeah, oh, there's an election coming up. Oh yeah, I better get my ballot. Oh yeah, I better figure out who's running, and they wake up, 3 or 4 days before the election and cast their ballots. And so those commercials have a powerful impact, or can, in a close race. Anyway, so Annette Tadeo, her campaign really hasn't crystallized, and I think she's largely unknown to the general public in Florida. But she comes from Miami-Dade. She is Latina. She has run statewide before. She's got a solid, consistent Democratic voting record in the Florida legislature. No one has questioned her commitment to Democratic principles. That's a topic maybe for another time, Lester, but I saw it today, just this afternoon. The Democrats are splintering on important issues. They're not sticking together. They're not cohesive enough. And today the issue was bringing secrecy to searches for university presidents. That bill passed, and that bill only passed because 4 Democrats voted for that secrecy.
Wow.
Annette Tadeo was not one of them. As I said, she's a
Right.
consistent. But anyway, so those are the 3 Democrats for governor. I think that, again, it's an August 23rd primary, so it's going to reach its peak in the dead of summer when it's really difficult to campaign in this state, and not a lot of people are paying attention. And people are very familiar with Charlie Crist. And I think if you're a committed Democrat, you're saying to yourself, I want somebody who can beat Ron DeSantis. Who out there can beat Ron DeSantis? Because if the Democrats can pull off a miracle and defeat Ron DeSantis, he will never be president of the United States. He will never be a plausible candidate for president. It's over.
Right.
So that's why I think you touched on this briefly, Lester, but national donors are avoiding Florida for lots of reasons. And that's been widely reported. That's a sad thing. It makes everything much more difficult. But I do think there's going to be an influx of out-of-state, big-time national money if it looks like the Democrats have a legitimate chance to defeat DeSantis.
Right.
Because you're stopping a serious candidate for president.
But he's sitting on $80 million now, right, in his campaign accounts. And you and I have talked about this before, and it's sort of parenthetical, but talk a little bit about why it is so expensive to run a statewide campaign in Florida.
It is so expensive to run a campaign in Florida because there is no other state that's wired this way. Say that literally and figuratively.
Right.
10 television markets, and none of them is really much bigger than any of the other ones. I'll go into that. I have a background. I worked in television for 10 years. I've been to almost every television station and market in this state. But the Tampa, St. Pete market and Miami are about the same size. And Orlando and Jacksonville are sort of the same size. Then they get small, and your other markets, of course, are obvious. Gainesville is a TV market. Pensacola is its own TV market. Panama City, Tallahassee. I'm missing one.
Daytona.
Daytona is part of the Orlando market. Oh. Fort Myers is a separate television market, fairly good sized. And so you're running statewide. You've got to. The last time I checked, the last time we wrote about this, to have a meaningful television presence throughout the state is going to cost about $2 million a week. That's $2 million last week, $2 million this week, $2 million next week. You've just gone through $6 million to put a television 30-second ad on, which is obviously a 30-second ad that's competing with your local GMC truck dealership, your local credit union, and everything else that's on TV. So it is phenomenally expensive because to take Georgia as a handy example, look at Georgia. Georgia's bigger than we are geographically, bigger than Florida, yet it only has one dominant television market, Atlanta. Does everybody watch Atlanta? No. If you live in Brunswick, Georgia, you're probably not watching Atlanta television. But if you buy TV ads in the Atlanta market, you are saturating to a large degree the whole state.
Yeah.
You can't do that in this state with one television market. It can't be done. So.
Do you see, you were talking previously about the large donors, do you see Democratic progressive donors engaging, or is it a matter of let's wait a few months and see what the polling numbers look like for DeSantis and one of these three Democrat candidates?
Yeah, I don't see them engaging until it looks like DeSantis is really beatable. The first answer to that equation is going to be in the primary for governor in August. Does Charlie Crist win the nomination by the skin of his teeth? I'm not saying he should win or will win. I'm saying that based on name ID and fundraising too, I think at the moment he's the most likely to win, I think. So does he win with 51% of the vote, or does he get 80% of the vote? And if he gets 80% of the vote, which I don't think is likely, but if he does, then it sends a message that, hey, you know what? The Democrats are united behind this guy. He may not be the perfect candidate, but that's a telling sign is how the vote breaks down among Democrats in the primary, and whether a lot of Democrats show up and whether they're fired up. The problem with the national donors getting involved in Florida is because there is not an unlimited amount of national money. And you've got right up the road, you've got Stacey Abrams running for governor of Georgia. And with what happened in Georgia in 2020, Georgia is now trending blue. And while Georgia, as I said, has the one big TV market in Atlanta, Georgia's not exactly cheap either. A big state, a big rangy state, with lots of rural areas and lots of urban areas. And so, but if I'm a donor, if I'm a trial lawyer in Chicago who wants to get Democrats elected, I look at the landscape and I think Stacey Abrams can win because they've just elected 2 Democratic U.S. senators in Georgia, something people thought was impossible. So there has to be that sense of hope that it's attainable, and Democrats have not made that sale yet in Florida.
Just to shift gears a little bit, as you know, obviously but as probably many of the people participating in this session know, we're going through the reapportionment session. Florida grew between 2010 and 2020 by almost 3 million new residents. And because of population losses in other states, we're going to gain an additional congressional seat, a new 28th district. How is the reapportionment playing out in your view?
It's been largely under the radar because Republicans are trying to avoid the mistakes they made 10 years ago. So they've taken the whole thing underground, basically. No hearings around the state, no real meaningful opportunity for public input. It has been surprisingly not very contentious in the legislature, at least not in the Senate. The Republicans do not want the redistricting fight to spill into the courts. Ron DeSantis might, but the legislature does not, because even with an increasingly conservative judicial branch, that's a roll of the dice. You don't know what a judge or a panel of judges are going to do. And so, again, most Democrats in the Senate voted for Republican-drawn maps. They don't really.
That map's gotten pretty good grades from what I consider to be impartial analysis by some of the universities in the North that are studying the redistricting that's going on in all the states right now. The Senate map.
There was an important development on redistricting today, a few hours ago. Ron DeSantis did something unheard of. DeSantis basically drew his own congressional map, and he drew it in such a way that it would basically get rid of the district that Al Lawson from Tallahassee represents in Congress, a black Democrat. It is an unusual district, but it passed muster with the courts last time. It's a district that basically starts on the west side of Jacksonville and comes all the way to Tallahassee. It is basically follows the I-10 corridor. How do you draw in northeast Florida, north central, the northern tier of the state? How do you draw a state that's winnable for a black candidate?
Right.
Because the nature of housing patterns and stuff, it's going to look very elongated and unusual. Anyway, DeSantis wanted to redraw the district, but he wanted the Florida Supreme Court to give him an advisory opinion that what he was doing was right. And at 11 o'clock this morning, the court said no. The court basically told Ron DeSantis to pound sand, basically, and said, we're not going to give you an advisory opinion. And it seemed based in sound logic to me, which is that there's no body of evidence and record on record for the Supreme Court to intelligently make a decision on this case. So the Florida Supreme Court took a pass. The maps are likely to be at the Florida Supreme Court eventually anyway, because
Right.
even though, as you said, even though there has been fairly benign sort of, these maps look okay, it is more likely than not that there's going to be a lawsuit challenging these maps.
Yeah.
And that lawsuit will work its way through the system and it will get to the Florida Supreme Court pretty quickly.
That's really interesting. And in my judgment and experience, the fact that the governor has inserted himself into the reapportionment process at this stage is unprecedented in my memory.
Yeah. By law, under the Constitution, he can veto a congressional redistricting map. He cannot veto a legislative map. That's really
Right.
out of his, that's why you see him only messing around with the congressional districts, because that's really the only place where he has any real legal authority. I thought he should have stayed out of it. But again, you know, the fact that legislators are drawing their own districts, even with the fair districts amendments to the Constitution, it is a blatant conflict of interest. But the majority of states do it this way as well. And in a lot of states, they don't, like, I'm watching what's happening in North Carolina, for example. That's going through the courts, blatant allegations of blatant gerrymandering in North Carolina, because North Carolina voters did not put the fair districts amendments in their constitution. That was really an important step forward that the voters of this state took. I think it was 6 or 8 years ago.
Yes.
Basically, you cannot, it is illegal in this state to draw districts that favor a party or favor an incumbent.
Right.
It's
Now, the
illegal.
Republicans happen to be in charge of this process, but you and I have both seen it when the Democrats were in charge, and it was just as partisan. It's those who hold the power wield it to draw up, as you point out, the districts that are most favorable to their opinions and their members.
That's right. You know, and like you said, we're getting one more congressional seat, a new seat, which appears to me to be generally between somewhere around Western Orange and Polk County, in that general vicinity along the I-4 corridor, where there's been tremendous growth.
That's where most of the growth has been. Of that 3 million, I think almost 1.8 million of those new residents are in that roughly defined as the I-4 corridor. And as you said, Orange County, Osceola County, Polk County is where we've seen the explosive growth. And you have the political map. There are no congressional seats that are going to come out of Northwest Florida as for a Democrat. The Republicans control Northwest Florida. It's as red as it gets.
They do.
Miami, go ahead, please.
Well, just no, I was, on a more broader theme, but along with what you're saying, this is really striking. And this is what, again, complicates things and has undermined the two-party system. We have 67 counties in Florida, but the number of counties that the Democrats have been winning consistently in statewide elections is about 9. The Democrats win about 9 counties. The Democrats can't even get into double figures. Now, yet, even though they're only winning 9 counties, they're losing races by like 0.3 of a percentage point. Well, how is that possible? I know many in the audience will know this, but I want to. It's so astoundingly odd, and but it's a reflection of how Florida has evolved and developed, is that Southeast Florida, Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach are overwhelmingly Democratic. After that, Tampa, St. Petersburg is slightly Democratic. The counties of Orange and Osceola are Democratic. The two big university counties of Alachua and Leon are both overwhelmingly Democratic. And Gadsden County, a small county just west of Tallahassee, is of course majority black and heavily Democratic. Almost every other place is Republican, everywhere. And so you say to yourself, well, in Indian River County, Charlotte County, Flagler County, these are small counties. That's true, but there's about 45 of those. And you add them up and you've got a heck of a lot of Republican votes. And the other thing that's interesting to see, which is a reminder to me, is one of the first things I'll be looking at on election night is what the voter turnout is in Sumter County. Why Sumter County? That's where most of the villages is. And right. in the last election, in the last two elections, the turnout in Sumter County is off the charts high. It's in the upper 80s, which means almost everyone who's registered to vote, almost everyone who's registered is voting. And my feeling is that if you are that dedicated and determined to vote, then you deserve to win. Yeah. Because you're getting your people out to vote, and that's the kind of fervor and commitment to voting that the Democrats need to discover.
Very good. We have a couple of questions, Steve. This says, Governor DeSantis blasted a bill today that impacts Everglades restoration, and the bill was easily passed by the Florida Senate. Does this portend any possible rift between the governor and the legislature, or specifically between the governor and the Senate president?
A good question, and I've been covering it like a blanket for the last 36 hours, and I'll write a column on it this week. This is a fascinating story with tentacles going in lots of different directions. I'll give a truncated answer, but I see serious friction developing between Ron DeSantis and between him and Wilton Simpson, the president of the Senate. It's been building very slightly, but again, I don't know what legislator in his right mind wants to pick a fight with Ron DeSantis. In a legislative session, the governor holds almost all the cards. He can veto anything. He can rally public opinion to his side. No one could pick Wilton Simpson out of a lineup in this state, but everybody knows who Ron DeSantis is. And on this issue, which I'll distill it, which is the fact that the constituency for clean water in South Florida, the Everglades Foundation, fishing captains, fishing guides, sport fishermen, recreational anglers, local officials, the water management district, think that the Senate is messing around and manipulating the funding formula for this reservoir south of the lake, which DeSantis has endorsed wholeheartedly. And DeSantis has strong environmental support on this issue, and it is not an overstatement, I don't think, to think that this is the issue that can seal DeSantis's reelection, because for all the things he's doing that people really revile, that are divisive, that are distractions, like this anti-critical race theory nonsense, on this issue with the future of the water and the future of Lake Okeechobee, I think public opinion is clearly on DeSantis's side. The subtext to this whole thing is that the environmental community is convinced that Big Sugar owns this legislature, lock, stock, and barrel. And that's why you're seeing senators maneuvering here in the middle of the session to sort of change the funding formula. The environmentalists say it's to protect Big Sugar. So that's where that issue is. And what happened this morning, DeSantis said that criticized the Senate, and then Wilton Simpson came back with a statement basically nebulously saying that it was involved political gamesmanship. But I think Ron DeSantis has the upper hand on this issue.
That's fascinating.
Yep.
We have a question. Do you think Gwen Graham will ever be resurrected? Give a little context about Gwen Graham, just for
Well,
those who don't.
this is an interesting parlor game because Gwen Graham was one of, I think my memory is, there were 5 or 6 Democrats who ran for governor last time. And of course, Andrew Gillum was the nominee, former mayor of Tallahassee, and came within 33,000 votes of winning. Astonishing to me. I never thought Gillum would be that competitive a candidate, but Gillum was an inspiring presence to young voters and voters of color. Didn't work out. Gwen Graham, I think, as my memory serves, finished sort of a distant second or third in that race, maybe a distant second.
Yeah.
And people said, you know, darn it, if Gwen Graham had been the nominee, DeSantis never would have won. To which I say, oh, really? Says who? I don't necessarily subscribe to that. You can't really predict. Andrew Gillum inspired lots of people. He also inspired, I think, a lot of people who raced to the polls, older conservative voters who didn't want, let's say it, didn't want a black man living in the governor's mansion. Okay, Florida's not ready for that, I contend. So anyway, Gwen has a really good job at the U.S. Department of Education, and she's spending a lot of time with her mom and dad, who now live in Gainesville. And you know, Bob Graham is getting up there in years. Good governor, good person. And so running for a statewide office and failing and losing, I've covered enough elections. It takes an awful lot out of you, not just financially, but emotionally. It is a life-altering experience.
Yes.
It is beyond grueling, and so you don't do that lightly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, it's been fascinating. As usual, I've got a page of notes based on what you said. I always learn something. And on behalf of the Florida chapter, we want to thank you again for your time and insights today.
Okay, Lester.
Macy, is there anything else we need to accomplish here?
There's no more questions in the question box.
Great.
Well, I appreciate it, Lester. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Alex?